The sweep second hand of the Orfina Porsche design chronograph, a precise Swiss-made instrument calibrated for pilots, passed the 12. 1403. 3 minutes and 0 seconds beyond the designated primary contact window. Alara Cohen shifted the weight of her shoulder bag, the friction of the worn leather strap against her linen blouse a familiar, grounding sensation. The Khan el-Khalili market was an oppressive sensory assault. The afternoon heat, radiating from the ancient cobblestones, was a physical weight, compounded by a cacophony of bartering voices, the metallic clang of coppersmiths' hammers, and the pervasive, cloying mixture of ground cardamom, roasting meat, and unburnt diesel fuel from the aging T-34 tank chassis used to power a nearby generator. Her designated contact point was a spice merchant's stall, the third one west from the central fountain, distinguished by a faded green awning. The recognition signal was a 1-kilogram bag of Iranian saffron, the most expensive item on display, placed to the immediate left of a set of brass balance scales. The signal was in place. The contact, codenamed Sparrow, was not. Her gaze, shielded by oversized sunglasses, swept across the crowded square in a practiced, systematic arc, a technique known as slicing the pie. She didn't just look. She deconstructed the scene into overlapping sectors, analyzing each for anomalies, for the subtle dissonances that signaled danger. She identified them instantly. 2 men, positioned by a refreshment stand selling hibiscus tea, were not drinking. They were observing. Their posture was a declaration of intent. General Intelligence Directorate, GID. Their gray suits were cheap, poorly tailored polyester that hung awkwardly on their frames. Too heavy for the Cairo heat, a classic sign of government functionaries trying to appear inconspicuous and failing utterly. But it was the subtle details her training had ingrained in her that screamed danger. The way they stood with their weight on the balls of their feet, a predator's stance, ready for explosive action. The unnatural stillness of their heads in the swirling chaos of the crowd. A telltale sign of focused surveillance. The fact that their shoes, though scuffed, were sturdy, practical footwear with thick rubber soles. Not the flimsy sandals worn by locals or the fashionable leather of tourists. They were hunters attempting to mimic idlers, and they were failing. The abort signal, drilled into her by her case officer Amos Levinson 2 nights prior, via a compressed high-speed burst transmission that lasted precisely 1.2 seconds, was the deliberate, clumsy dropping of a package. Any package. A fumbled purchase, a dropped book. It was a universal sign of a non-combatant, a tourist, designed to be ignored by everyone except the person it was meant for. Her eyes continued their scan of the periphery, mapping escape routes, identifying potential choke points and surveillance blind spots. The narrow alley behind the silversmiths, the crowded entrance to the Al-Hussein Mosque, the blind corner created by a cart piled high with watermelons. The protocol was unambiguous, a catechism learned through brutal repetition. 3 minutes past the contact window, no contact. With hostile surveillance present, you walk. You do not run. You do not look back. You melt away and initiate exfiltration procedures. But the intelligence promised by Sparrow was graded A1 by the Mossad's Analysis Division. A direct, time-sensitive warning concerning Operation Nile Serpent. To walk away now was to sever a vital nerve, to fly blind into a storm. A small child, laughing as he chased a flock of pigeons, darted directly into her path. She sidestepped with fluid economy of motion, her gaze never breaking from its circuit. The stall, the suits, the shifting patterns of the crowd. 1404. 4 minutes. An eternity in this profession, long enough for a world to end. A single bead of sweat detached from her hairline and traced a cold path down her temple. The GID men had not shifted their position. They were fixed points of menace in a universe of random motion. Her training, the voice of Amos in her head, screamed at her to abort, to sever, to survive. Her instincts, honed over a dozen assignments in hostile territory, urged patience. Sparrow, a junior clerk in the Egyptian Ministry of Defense's procurement office, had been a reliable, if low-level asset for 6 solid months. His intel on Egyptian armored dispositions and logistics in the Canal Zone had directly led to the successful IAF strike that had saved 2 F-4 Phantom crews just last month. He was nervous, but he was not a coward. He would not miss a meet of this gravity without a compelling reason. That reason was almost certainly standing by the refreshment stand, drinking nothing. Then she saw him. Sparrow. He emerged from a narrow alleyway connecting to the main square, and his pace was all wrong. Too fast, too jerky, his shoulders hunched as if against a physical blow. His face, normally a warm olive tone, was a pale, sickly gray. His eyes were wide, scanning not for her, but past her, toward an exit on the far side of the square. He was a man in a trap, looking for an escape he knew did not exist. And then she saw the third hunter. 20 meters behind Sparrow, moving at a parallel pace, was another man in an identical gray suit. They were bracketing him, a classic 3-man surveillance and containment team. The 2 by the T-stand were the fixed posts, the anvils, meant to observe and close the trap. This third man was the hammer. It was over for him. He was a ghost, and he knew it. For a fraction of a second, his frantic gaze met hers. It was a spark of contact across a gulf of failure. A barely perceptible shake of his head, a minuscule gesture of negation. Go. Run. Save yourself. He was warning her off, even as his own world was collapsing. But then, in a final act of desperate professionalism, he did something unplanned. He stumbled, a theatrical, convincing lurch, colliding with a street vendor pushing a cart stacked high with the daily edition of Al-Ahram. Newspapers exploded into the air, scattering across the cobblestones like dry leaves in a gust of wind. In the brief, chaotic moment of apology and confusion, Sparrow bent down, ostensibly to help gather the papers. The GID men, momentarily blocked by the vendor's cart, quickened their pace. Sparrow straightened up, a single folded newspaper in his hand, and continued his hurried walk toward the alley. He passed Alara. He did not look at her. His hand, slick with sweat, brushed against hers. The folded newspaper, a small, dense weight, was transferred from his palm to hers in a movement so swift and subtle it was more a prenomination of contact than a physical act. Then he was gone, absorbed by the current of the crowd. The 2 GID men, now only 5 meters behind him. The third moving to cut off the alley's exit. Alara did not run. She maintained her slow, measured tourist's pace, the newspaper now concealed inside her own bag, held tight against her body. She paused at a stall selling silver trinkets, feigning interest in a filigree bracelet, her body angled to present a non-threatening profile, her ears straining for the sounds of the inevitable. There were no shouts, no sounds of a struggle, no gunshot. They were professionals. They would have taken him quietly, a hand on the arm, a whispered threat, a car waiting in the alley. Silent, efficient. She spent 10 minutes haggling over the worthless bracelet, paying a third of the asking price, establishing her cover as a frugal tourist. Then she left the market through a northern exit, a different route from her arrival, and began the long, circuitous walk back to her apartment. This was the dry cleaning run, a counter-surveillance drill designed to shake any potential tail. It involved 3 changes of taxi, each one hailed and dismissed with calculated randomness. She entered a crowded department store through the main entrance, ascended 2 floors on the escalator, descended 1 on the stairs, and exited through a service door into a back alley. She used the large plate glass windows of storefronts as improvised mirrors, scanning the reflections for anyone matching her pace or turning when she turned. Only after an hour of this painstaking, paranoid ballet was she certain she was clean. Back in her small, sparsely furnished apartment in the Zamalek district, she double-locked the door and drew the heavy blackout curtains, plunging the room into stifling gloom. The air was stale and hot, thick with the silence of solitude. She retrieved the newspaper. It was the previous day's Al-Ahram, as expected. On page 3 in the classified section, a small advertisement for a used Fiat 124 had been circled in faint pencil. This was the key. Using the tip of a sewing pin, she meticulously pricked 5 specific letters within the text of the ad, a sequence determined by the day's code derived from the closing prices of the London Stock Exchange. LUNAH. She transcribed the letters onto a small notepad. She turned to her communication device, a Braun T1000 world receiver radio that had been gutted and rebuilt by Mossad technicians, its internals replaced with a state-of-the-art burst transmission unit. From a hidden compartment in the heel of her shoe, she removed a one-time pad, a small booklet of silk pages filled with random 5-character groups designed to be easily destroyed by swallowing or burning. She found the page corresponding to the day's date, located the first character group beginning with L, and began the painstaking process of manual decryption, subtracting the value of the pad's characters from the value of her coded message. The resulting plaintext was 2 words. 2 words that felt like a physical blow, turning her blood to ice. Trap set. The mission to acquire the Soviet general's SAM deployment maps was not just compromised. It was a baited hook, and they were the fish swimming towards it. The emergency signal from Cairo, a compressed data burst containing Ilara's 2-word message, reached the Mossad Command and Control Center, a heavily fortified, windowless building hidden behind the facade of a telecommunications company on King Saul Boulevard in Tel Aviv at 1742 Zulu time. The raw transmission, lasting only 0.8 seconds and piggybacked on a legitimate commercial satellite uplink, was automatically shunted through a series of decryption servers. The message was printed by a secure teletype machine on the desk of Zvi Zamir, the director of Mossad, less than 2 minutes later. He read the words, his face impassive, and pressed a single red button on his console. An immediate, mandatory briefing was convened. In the soundproofed, lead-lined strategic planning room known as the Aquarium, the 3 individuals responsible for Operation Nile Serpent assembled. First was the mission controller, Amos Levinson, known within the agency only by his call sign, the Watchmaker. Amos was 48, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience. A veteran of the Palmach's pre-statehood struggles and a founding member of Sayeret Matkal, Israel's elite special forces unit. His legend was forged in the crucible of the Tripoli infiltration of 1968. Posing as a West German hydraulics engineer specializing in port machinery, he had spent 6 months inside a Libyan military facility, meticulously mapping its entire infrastructure, power grids, communication lines, sewer tunnels, for a future raid. He was not just playing a role. He had become Dieter Schmidt, a man obsessed with fluid dynamics and pressure tolerances. The defining moment of that operation, the one they told new recruits about at the training academy, came during a surprise inspection by a suspicious Libyan colonel, accompanied by a Stasi advisor, a man named Richter, whose eyes missed nothing. They had cornered him in his small on-site office, the blueprints for a new pumping station spread out on his desk. Richter, tapping a manicured finger on a specific diagram, pointed out a discrepancy between Amos's design for a flow regulator and the Soviet-provided manufacturer's specifications. A lesser agent would have panicked, stammered, been exposed. Amos, as Schmidt, became incandescent with professional indignation. He launched into a 10-minute, highly technical tirade in fluent German, his voice echoing in the small concrete room, about the inferior quality of Libyan cast concrete, its low aggregate density and high porosity requiring a 15% reduction in operational pressure to avoid catastrophic pipeline failure. He spoke of Pascal's law, Bernoulli's principle, and cavitation erosion, grabbing a piece of chalk and scrawling complex fluid dynamics equations on a nearby blackboard. He was so convincing, so utterly immersed in the minutiae of his cover, that the colonel ended up apologizing for questioning his expertise, while the Stasi man, for the first time, looked uncertain. This was Amos's singular genius, the construction of impenetrable operational architecture. He built missions like a Swiss watchmaker builds a grand complication chronometer. Every gear, spring and lever interlocking with microscopic precision, with multiple redundancies, all designed to function under the most extreme pressure imaginable. He was a grandmaster of the long game, a practitioner of paranoia refined into a predictive science. Sitting beside him, radiating a nervous energy that contrasted sharply with Amos's stillness, was David Ben Zion, the gadgeteer. David was a different breed entirely, a prodigy from the Technion, Israel's premier technology institute. He held doctorates in quantum physics and electrical engineering. He was recruited directly into Mossad's technology and development division, Neviot. After he demonstrated a method for embedding a functional, audio-activated microphone inside a standard cube of sugar, capable of transmitting for 3 hours before dissolving. His masterpiece was the microdot communication system used during the Beirut embassy operation, which allowed agents to photographically reduce entire documents to the size of a single period on a typed page, rendering them virtually undetectable. David saw the world not in terms of people and ideologies, but as a series of physical problems awaiting elegant solutions. He believed any security system could be bypassed, any secret could be exfiltrated, any fortress could be breached, with the right application of physics and the right tool. His job was to build that tool. The third person was not physically present, but her file, stamped Top Secret Serpent, was open on the polished mahogany table. Elara Cohen, the ghost. Born on a kibbutz in the Galilee, she was a linguistic prodigy, fluent in 5 languages, including unaccented Egyptian Arabic, formal Russian, and Farsi. Her recruitment file noted an almost preternatural ability for mimicry and what the psychologists termed deep social camouflage. Her defining operational moment came in Damascus in 1969. Tasked with making contact with a high-level Syrian Air Force colonel who was a key planner for their air defenses, she discovered through painstaking research that he had a crippling, secret gambling addiction. Posing as a dissolute French heiress with a taste for risk, she engineered a series of high-stakes poker games in a private suite at a Beirut hotel. She allowed him to win initially, then systematically entrapped him, indebting him to her for a sum he could never repay. She did not blackmail him. That was crude and unreliable. Instead, she offered to clear his entire debt in exchange for a small amount of business advice. He became one of Mossad's most valuable assets in Syria, codenamed the Falcon. Alara's skill was not in technology or grand strategy, but in the subtle, patient manipulation of human weakness. These three were the architects and the instrument of an operation whose success or failure was now being weighed against a complex and dangerous international chessboard. Their mission did not exist in a vacuum. In Cyprus, the CIA's Operation Sandpiper was actively trying to recruit a disgruntled Egyptian Air Force general, a clumsy effort that risked triggering a massive GID counterintelligence sweep that could inadvertently catch Alara in its net. Simultaneously, Britain's MI6 was running Operation Nile Perch, using the nuclear attack submarine HMS Valiant to tap into undersea communication cables and monitor Soviet arms shipments into the port of Alexandria. A misplaced signal or a botched dead drop by Amos's team could be misinterpreted by the British as hostile electronic warfare, potentially leading to a blue-on-blue incident with fatal consequences. Every move they made carried the risk of colliding with the unseen operations of allies and adversaries alike. The asset they were trying to cultivate was infinitely more significant than a ministry clerk. He was Soviet Major General Vasily Orlov, the chief military advisor to the Egyptian Third Army and the principal architect of the new air defense barrier along the Suez Canal. A 30-year veteran of the Great Patriotic War and the Red Army, Orlov was a true believer who had lost his faith. His son, Mikhail, a brilliant and reformist history student at Moscow State University, had been arrested by the KGB during a Brezhnev-era purge of intellectuals. Accused of anti-Soviet agitation, he had been sentenced to 10 years in a hard labor camp in Vorkuta, a sentence that was effectively a death warrant. Orlov's disillusionment was total and corrosive. He saw the Soviet involvement in Egypt not as the fraternal assistance promised by propaganda, but as a cynical, colonialist adventure, propping up a corrupt regime for geopolitical gain. He felt his life's work, his service to the party and the state, had been a lie. And he was now willing to burn the entire edifice to the ground. His potential value was incalculable. He possessed the one thing Israel needed more than tanks, planes, or bombs: the complete, unredacted schematics and operational doctrine of Egypt's Soviet-built air defense network. The geopolitical chessboard of 1970 was a bloody stalemate, focused on a single, searing line of sand: the Suez Canal. The Israeli victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 had been strategically stunning but politically inconclusive. It had not brought peace. It had created a new static front line. From late 1967 to 1970, this line became the focal point of the brutal war of attrition. Egypt, under the charismatic leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, was determined to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula through military force. Israel was equally determined to hold it. The war was a relentless grind of artillery duels, cross-canal commando raids, and most critically, a desperate struggle for control of the air. Initially, the Israeli Air Force, IAF, held undisputed dominance. Their French-built Mirage III fighters and newly acquired American F-4 Phantom II jets could strike at will, conducting deep penetration raids against Egyptian military infrastructure and strategic economic targets. This was air superiority, the central pillar of the Israeli Defense Forces doctrine. But in early 1970, the strategic balance began to shift dramatically. The Soviet Union, Egypt's primary patron, initiated a massive escalation of its involvement under the codename Operation Kavkaz. This was not merely an infusion of hardware. It was a direct deployment of Soviet military power. Entire squadrons of MiG-21 fighters, flown by elite Soviet pilots, arrived to challenge the IAF. Most importantly, the Soviets began constructing a dense, layered, and technologically formidable integrated air defense system, IADS, along the western bank of the canal. This was not a simple collection of anti-aircraft guns. It was a fortress of steel and electronics, a meticulously planned killing zone. Note, the backbone of this system was the S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2 Guideline, the same high-altitude missile system that had downed Gary Power's U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. This was supplemented by the newer, more mobile, and lower-altitude S-125 Neva Yos Pechora, the SA-3 Goa. These missile batteries were networked with advanced P-12 spoon rest, early warning radars, and fan-song guidance radars, all controlled from hardened command bunkers and coordinated by Soviet technicians. It was a technological wall designed to bleed the IAF white, and it was working. On June 30th, 1970, 2 IAF Phantoms were shot down by SA-2s. In the first week of July, 3 more were lost. In August, another 2 Phantoms and a Skyhawk fell from the sky. The psychological impact on Israel was immense. The invincible IAF was suddenly, shockingly vulnerable. The pilots, who once considered themselves masters of the sky, were now flying into what they grimly called Missile Alley. Israeli military intelligence, Aman, struggled to provide actionable intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance flights were now tantamount to suicide missions. Electronic intelligence, ELINT, aircraft flying along the periphery, were met with sophisticated Soviet electronic countermeasures, including deceptive frequency hopping and powerful jamming signals that blinded their sensors. Human intelligence, HUMINT, on the ground, was sparse. The Egyptian military was a closed, paranoid society, and the Soviet advisors were a hermetically sealed fortress within that society. Israel was fighting an enemy it could no longer effectively see. The genesis of Operation Nile Serpent was a single, catastrophic event. On September 3, 1970, an IAF F-4 Phantom from the 201st, the 1 Squadron, was on a high-speed, low-altitude reconnaissance mission over the southern part of the canal zone when its electronic warning receiver began to scream. But the signal signature was terrifyingly new. It wasn't the familiar warble of an SA-2's fan-song radar or the insistent chirp of an SA-3. This was a complex, continuous wave signal the pilot had never encountered. Before he could react, a missile, described later as looking like a telephone pole with fins, slammed into his aircraft. The crew ejected. The pilot was captured by Egyptian forces. The navigator was killed during the ejection. The wreckage of the Phantom, however, held a vital secret. Amman analysts, working with fragments recovered by a covert Sayeret Matkal team, made a horrifying discovery. The data, cross-referenced with intelligence from a NATO source, pointed to one conclusion. The Soviets had secretly deployed their newest, most advanced mobile SAM system, the 2K-12 Cube, known to NATO as the SA-6 Gainful. It was a quantum leap in technology and a tactical game-changer. Unlike the static, cumbersome SA-2s and SA-3s, the entire SA-6 system, radar and launchers, was mounted on a tracked vehicle. It could move, hide in a desert wadi, shoot, and then relocate in minutes. It was a phantom, a ghost on the battlefield. The existing IAF tactics for suppression of enemy air defenses, SEAD, were rendered obsolete overnight. A crisis meeting was convened in the Tel Aviv office of Prime Minister Golda Meir. The head of the IAF, Major General Mordecai Hod, was blunt and grim. We are approaching a point where the attrition rate for operating over the canal will be unsustainable. We will lose air superiority. If we lose that, we risk losing the next war before it even begins. It was in this atmosphere of existential crisis that a faint signal emerged from the noise. A low-level Mossad asset in Cairo, the clerk Sparrow, reported a piece of ambient intelligence. A whisper overheard in the halls of the Defense Ministry. A high-ranking Soviet general was drinking heavily in the diplomatic clubs. He was speaking carelessly, complaining about Moscow's bureaucracy and the incompetence of his Egyptian counterparts. The general's name was Vasily Orlov. Mossad's research division, the Tsomet department, worked for 72 hours straight, building a comprehensive psychological and behavioral file. They found the detailed story of his son, Mikhail. They found records of his official complaints to the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, about faulty equipment and poor Egyptian maintenance protocols. They found a clear pattern of behavior indicating profound, systemic disillusionment. Zvi Zamir made the call. This was not a target for slow, patient cultivation over years. This was a target of opportunity, a window of psychological vulnerability that could close at any moment. The objective was absolute, non-negotiable, and clear. Obtain Orlov's complete order of battle. Not just the location of the known SAM batteries, but everything. The command and control frequencies, the radar coverage maps showing gaps and terrain-masked dead zones, the reloading schedules and logistics chains, the secret deployment locations of the new SA-6 units, and, most critically, the rules of engagement for the Soviet crews. They needed the enemy's Bible. And General Vasily Orlov was its sole author. The mission was approved under the highest level of classification. It was named Operation Nile Serpent, and the message from the captured Sparrow, "Trap set," now cast a long, dark shadow over it all. Amos Levinson, his face illuminated by the single overhead lamp in the aquarium, stared at the two words on the teletype printout. The GID knew about their low-level network. That was a tactical blow, but manageable. The real, terrifying question was, what else did they know? Was the trap intended for the clerk, or was it for Orlov? Or, worst of all, was it for Alara? Amos Levinson's first directive, transmitted to Alara in a new emergency burst encrypted with a one-time pad she had to retrieve from a hollowed-out bolt securing the water tank of her toilet, was unequivocal. Go dark. Cease all contact. Erase operational footprint. Await signal. For the next 2 weeks, Alara Cohen became exactly what her cover prescribed. She was Juliette Dubois, a postgraduate art history student from the Sorbonne, sketching architectural details in the Museum of Islamic Art. Her evenings spent reading Camus and Sartre in quiet cafes in the affluent Garden City district. She spoke to no one beyond perfunctory exchanges with waiters and shopkeepers. She made no suspicious moves. She simply existed, a ghost hiding in plain sight, a state of deep cover that was psychologically taxing, but essential for survival. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, and at a forward operational base in Athens, Amos and David deconstructed the mission piece by piece. The trap set message was a tactical earthquake that had shattered their operational architecture. Their initial plan had relied on Sparrow's network for logistics, safe houses, and dead drops. That entire network was now assumed to be compromised, its members either captured or under GID surveillance. They had to operate under the new, chilling assumption that the GID, likely assisted by their Stasi and KGB advisors, were actively hunting for a high-level Israeli operative in Cairo. Colonel Farid al-Masri, the head of the GID's counter-espionage unit, was a known quantity to Amos. He had studied al-Masri's file in excruciating detail. The man was a product of the Stasi's infamous Hauptverwaltung A, HVA, training academy in East Berlin. Methodical, patient, technologically savvy, and utterly ruthless. Al-Masri would not be content with simply rolling up a single low-level network. He would use the captured agents as bait, hoping to lure a bigger fish. That meant General Orlov himself was now under an intense, invisible microscope. Any direct approach was now suicide. Amos's new plan was based on a principle he called quantum espionage. The ability to observe and signal a target without physically interacting with it, leaving no trace of the observation itself. The burden fell on David. He was tasked with devising a method to get a message to Orlov that was completely deniable, untraceable, and could be delivered in a public space. David spent a week in a secure room, poring over satellite imagery, street-level photographs taken by Sayanim, volunteer Jewish helpers, and human reports detailing Orlov's daily routine. The general lived in a heavily guarded Soviet diplomatic compound in Doki, a fortress of walls and cameras. But he had one small, predictable vulnerability. Every Thursday afternoon, between 15 and 16 Espaos, he visited a small, state-run bookstore on Adley Street that specialized in Russian literature and translated classics. It was his only private indulgence, a brief escape from his military duties and political minders. Before they could risk Alara, however, they had to be certain Orlov's routine hadn't been altered by the recent GID activity. For this, they needed a new local asset, a sacrificial pawn, as Amos clinically described it. The candidate was a man named Simon, a Coptic Christian who owned a small antiquarian bookshop in the old city. His family had been persecuted under Nasser's pan-Arab nationalism, and his resentment ran deep. Recruiting him was Ilara's first task upon being reactivated. She approached him not as a spy, but as Juliet, the French student, looking for rare Coptic manuscripts. Over 3 visits, she built a rapport speaking of history, of lost cultures, of the injustice of the powerful. On the 4th visit, she placed a book on his counter, a French edition of The Count of Monte Cristo. Tucked inside was a photograph of his brother, a political activist imprisoned in the notorious Torah prison. On the back of the photo was a single word: help? Simon agreed. His mission was simple surveillance. He was to sit in a cafe.